The rented Ford Expedition, a battered veteran of countless cross-country hauls, filled the air with the cloying, synthetic smell of hot plastic and stale gasoline. Cross, an ex-infantryman whose spine was wired to the rhythm of patrol, killed the engine and felt the silence shift. It was not just the cessation of road noise. It was a shift in the quality of the light and the silence. He pushed the door open and stepped out. The red dust of this part of the country, high up in the lonely canyons of western Montana, was nothing like the stuff he remembered from the deserts overseas. That dust had been light, quick, a mean-spirited powder that burned the lungs and settled everywhere. This was different. This dust was heavy. It did not hang in the air or drift in the weak afternoon breeze. It was a dense, cold grit that settled with a physical weight. When he licked his lips, the taste was chalky and alkaline like finely ground bone and soda. The very geology strained to pull the oxygen from the air. Moore, the geologist, was already out, ignoring the heat, which pushed 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and moving toward the nearest canyon cut. She was a woman who always looked slightly out of place in the field. Too clean, too focused on the infinitesimal, carrying a worn leather case that looked more suited for a bank director. She was already hunched over a sheer face of exposed rock, her brow furrowed in concentration. Wright, the theoretical archaeologist, joined him by the sport utility vehicle's open back hatch, the afternoon sun turning his thinning hair to copper wire. Wright was the reason they were here. A man who lived not in the present but in the frustrating, contradictory reality of the past. He held an old, cracked map of bleached linen. He ran a finger over the brittle surface. It does not make sense, Cross. I checked the coordinates a dozen times against the modern grid. There is nothing here. Just canyon floor. He tapped the spot. A faded ink cross, drawn by a shaky 19th century hand, marked a precise point in the middle of a geological blank spot. The land surveyors, the ones who drew this up, they marked this spot. They did not see anything, not according to the logbook, but they put a marker here, a warning, a hole in reality. Moore's voice, thin and strained, drifted back to them. Right, get over here and bring the thermal sensor. She stood by the cut, running a gloved hand over the layers. The stratification is all wrong. These layers should be brittle Dakota sandstone, maybe some Triassic deposits, but look at it. It is shale, but it carries the density of basalt. It is an anomaly, a geological lie. She tapped the rock face with her small hammer, and the sound it made was wrong. A dull, non-reverberating thud that swallowed the energy of the blow. The stone was cold, colder than the air. The canyon was silent. This was not the natural quiet of a remote place, where the buzz of insects or the whine of the wind through the juniper could be heard. A physical absence of sound pressed against his eardrums, a vacuum that mirrored the pressure of swimming too deep. It made his inner ear ache. Harper, the photographer, slung his heavy-bodied Nikon over his shoulder and started moving to set up a panoramic shot of the canyon rim, a man determined to capture the beautiful desolation. His movements were muted. The only thing that held sound was the scrape of his boot on the gritty stone. He raised the camera, sighted the vast, jagged sweep of the Montana sky meeting the canyon's edge, and pressed the shutter. He lowered the camera, his expression uneasy. "The picture comes out empty," he said. "The frame is wiped clean. It looks burned." Cross, meanwhile, was doing what he always did, checking the perimeter. Even here, Miles from nowhere, his training took over. He looked for a break in the landscape, a sign of intrusion, a potential avenue of attack. He was not looking for wildlife. He looked for intention. He found it 50 yards from their makeshift campsite, close to the canyon floor where the soil turned to hard-packed stone. At first, he thought it was a groove left by a heavy boulder rolling down the slope, but the line was too deliberate, too focused. He knelt, scraping away the heavy dust with the edge of his combat knife. It was not a groove. It was a print. The sheer size of the print was immediately wrong. It was too long for a wolf, far too broad for even a grizzly bear. It was roughly the size of a dinner plate, but the shape was what turned the blood cold in his veins. The shape was defined. 5 distinct toes, each ending not in a nail but in a hook. A talon, long and curved. These talons had not merely pressed into the ground, they had scored the stone. Basalt density shale. The print was an impossibility. It weighed far more than any known North American creature, half a ton, and it possessed a muscular structure that defied gravity. Wright and Moore joined him, drawn by the stillness of his posture. Moore frowned, her rational mind seeking an explanation. "It is wind erosion, Cross, or a rare fracture pattern in the bedrock." "Look at the direction of the force," Cross said, his voice flat. He pointed to the slight raised ridge of stone around the edges, where the mass had displaced the material. It was moving. It was running. And this was fresh. Wright pulled out his worn field guide. "It is a local legend, Cross. They have stories here about large predatory canids, a strain of timber wolf. A tall tail blown out of proportion." Cross did not bother to argue. He was a man who had lived by his instincts in places where a faulty calculation meant death. The cold feeling in his gut was not fear. It was the scent of danger, dry and acrid, like old cordite. It was the tension he remembered from the long, hot hours overseas when the silence meant the enemy waited, and the air held the metallic tang of dried blood. This was that same tension, but laced with something deeper, something prehistoric and profoundly wrong. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the canyon rim. "The camp stays as is for now," he announced, the decision already made. "We shift from archaeological dig to forward operating base. We are not alone. I start staggered watches tonight." The geologist and the anthropologist exchanged a look of polite academic skepticism, but they said nothing. They knew Cross's instinct was the only thing standing between them and the overwhelming dread that seeped from the canyon walls. Wright checked his archival map again, his fingers tracing the faded ink cross. The legend, the old settlers' accounts. They all spoke of a natural collapse here, a rock slide that buried a sacred site. But the wording always seemed too deliberate, too organized. They followed the line of the old crumbled scree slope Wright indicated. It looked like a natural, millennia-old collapse of loose shale, broken boulders, and wind-scoured dust. But at the bottom of the slump, where the earth should have been solid, Cross saw it. A rough-hewn stone lintel, partially buried, leading into the darkness. The stone, mortared with time and earth, held a distinct, deliberate chill that defied the outside air. He pulled his military-grade flashlight from his pack, the heavy beam cutting a weak yellow tunnel. The light struck the stonework and died. It did not reflect or illuminate. The stone absorbed it completely, leaving the darkness intact. "Well," Wright said, his voice now noticeably tight, "here we go. The hole in the map." Cross did not reply. He pulled the shotgun from its case, racked a shell into the chamber with a loud, businesslike snick, and started the long, unsettling descent. It was the first time in 10 years he felt the true cold weight of his combat gear, and it was not to fight men. He knew with an absolute functional certainty that the ordinary was over. Whatever waited below was already listening. He smelled it in the thick, heavy dust of the canyon floor. It smelled like the deep earth and something else. The cold, dry promise of the unspeakable. The entrance was a tight, unpleasant squeeze. A funnel of broken slate and fractured stone that forced them to drop their packs and shimmy through sideways. Cross went first, rifle held high, kicking loose shale ahead of him. The stone was slick with condensation, and the whole passage felt like the constricted throat of a dying thing. When he finally dropped into the first subterranean chamber, the silence, which had been so palpable outside, snapped and vanished. In its place was a pressure, a deep, resonant, pulsating thrum that came not from the walls, but from the bone beneath the soil, the earth's own ancient heartbeat. It was so low that it registered more in the soles of their boots and the pits of their stomachs than in their ears. Moore wrinkled her nose, switching on her headlamp. "The air is foul," she muttered. "Stale, of course, but there is a distinct mineral concentration. Iron and copper, but something else." She drew a deep, hesitant breath. "It is like old rust, but cleaner, sharper, metallic but organic. Like dried blood aged for 500 years. The chamber was small and roughly circular, clearly hewn out of the bedrock. It opened into a series of intersecting low-ceilinged tunnels. The temperature plunged from the high 80s above ground to 55 degrees Fahrenheit down here. The chill had nothing to do with physics. It was the absence of warmth, a profound coldness that gnawed at the joints. Wright was already moving to the walls, running his fingers over the crudely carved surfaces. The walls were covered in symbols. This was not the work of local indigenous tribes, whose pictographs he knew well. This was something mathematically precise, horrifying in its uniformity, a style that was unsettlingly formal. "Pre-Columbian," Wright whispered, his voice hushed by the sheer weight of the antiquity. "Something before the common migrations. Look at the repetition." He pointed a trembling finger. The motif was everywhere. A series of tight, vertical lines like bars, invariably capped by a snarling, unnaturally elongated muzzle. A wolf, but distorted, too human, too deliberate. They are not deities or hunting scenes. They are engineering diagrams, warnings. They moved deeper, turning a corner into a chamber that opened abruptly, its floor covered in a layer of fine, white dust. It was in this chamber that they found the remnants. They were bones, dozens of them. Not whole skeletons, but fragments scattered across the floor. The bones were bleached, dry, unnaturally white, as if all the marrow and life had been sucked out of them by time. Cross, a man who had seen bodies in pieces, engaged the familiar cold analytical switch. He studied the scene. "More, right? Look at the orientation. See how the major bones, femurs, ribs, are stripped clean and placed here, but the smaller joints, the hands and feet, are missing? Raptors? Cave scavengers?" Moore suggested, her voice thin. Cross shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on a clean, sharp fracture in a tibia. "Number. Not scavengers. Scavengers tear. They scatter. This was taken. Look at the precision. The joints were separated cleanly. It is almost anatomical. It was not the work of a frenzied beast. It was the work of an implement, or a body with surgical capability, a kind of violence that implied not hunger, but deliberate, careful harvesting. Harper, the photographer, was visibly pale, his hands shaking slightly as he set up his equipment. He knelt, checking the angle of the natural light filtering from the entrance, and placed a hand on the stone floor to steady himself. He pulled it back instantly. What the hell? What is it? Cross asked, stepping closer. Harper held up his glove. The fabric was stained with a thin, barely perceptible film. He pulled off the glove and touched the stone again with his bare finger. It is oily, he said, his voice a strained whisper. No, not oil. It is slick, dried sap, or grease. Something hardened but still tacky. Cross shone his beam over the floor. The stone was not slick with water or grime. It was coated in a thin, almost microscopic layer of what felt like dried varnish. It smelled faintly rancid, like old, solidified animal fat, the residue of an ancient crime, polished by time but never erased. As they worked, Moore setting up seismic sensors, Wright trying to photograph the symbols, Harper trying to capture the grisly tableau, the sound returned. This time it was a sustained tone. A low, resonant hum originated from beneath the very floor they stood on. It grew in intensity, a deep, protracted sigh that filled the subterranean chamber. Moore dropped her clipboard, her eyes wide. Did you feel that? It is not the walls. It comes up through the foundation. A low-frequency resonance. Subsonic. Tectonics? Wright asked, trying to sound professional. Moore shook her head, her face bleached white by her own lamp. Number. Tectonics is erratic. This is regular. It is a pulse, a rhythm. It is intentional. Like a massive, living thing breathes, very slowly, right under our feet. Cross did not need a geologist to tell him. He felt it in his chest, a deep, sympathetic vibration that resonated with his fear. The darkness around them gained substance. It was no longer an absence of light. It was a weight, an intention that closed in. He moved back toward the entrance, the cramped choke point he now thought of as their most vulnerable spot. He stopped and looked back at his companions, their faces pale and drawn in the cone of their lamps, trying to use science to firewall themselves against the horror they'd found. Plan changed, Cross said, his voice calm but devoid of any warmth. No more dig. We are cornered in a basement. We move to a proper defensive posture. Staggered patrols, 2-hour shifts. The rifle stays loaded, and the pistol stays out of the holster. From now on, you treat this place like enemy territory because that is what it is. The geologist and the anthropologist exchanged a look of polite academic skepticism, but they said nothing. They knew Cross's instinct was the only thing standing between them and the overwhelming dread that seeped from the canyon walls. Wright began to protest, his rational mind scrambling for academic propriety. Cross, this is excessive. We are hundreds of feet underground, miles from any population. We are in no immediate danger. Cross looked him dead in the eye, the faint yellow light catching the deep lines around his mouth. Wrong. Immediate danger is exactly what this is, Wright. This darkness has weight now. It has a smell. And something that leaves a print that deep in stone does not just pass through. It hunts. He walked away, leaving them in the pulsating gloom. The smell of burnt star and old grease hanging heavy in the air. The comfort of the known world, he realized, was already a mile above their heads. They had descended into something far older than history, and it sealed the lid on their fragile reality. The dawn, 90 feet and a lifetime away, brought no relief. Cross climbed out of the ruin's maw after his long, tense watch. The air inside was colder, the low thrum more insistent, and felt he shed a layer of dead skin. The Montana morning was brilliant, almost painfully clear, pushing the heat up toward the low 90s Fahrenheit already. The sun washed the canyons in a defiant yellow light. Moore had been running a set of proprietary sensors overnight. 3 small metallic stakes placed in a triangle around the entrance to measure minute fluctuations in the magnetic field and telluric currents. Her breakfast coffee had gone cold, untouched, beside her camp chair. "One of them is gone," she announced. She pointed to the ground 30 feet from the entrance. The earth was undisturbed, save for a faint depression where the sensor head had been seated. It was not ripped out or smashed. The casing was not broken. It was removed, extracted with care. Cross knelt, examining the spot. The fine, heavy dust was gently compressed, and there, wafting on the still morning air, was a thin, acrid scent. Not the metallic rot of the tunnel, but something sharp, like an electrical fire or the snapping of a copper wire. It was sulfur, but cleaner, drier. The smell of a burned-out vacuum. He walked the perimeter of the camp, his rifle held loosely, but ready. He found the evidence of what had taken Moore's sensor 30 yards out, where the scrub grass met the flat, stony expanse. The grass was flattened in a narrow, 2-foot-wide path that led away from the camp toward a high, shadowed ridge. Whatever took the sensor walked deliberately, upright. Meanwhile, Wright, huddled over his laptop, which was translating his rough notes from the wall etchings, let out a strangled cry of recognition. He beckoned Cross over, his face gleaming with a feverish combination of terror and intellectual thrill. "I have it," he whispered, pointing to a rendered sketch of the geometric symbols. "I thought they were stylized wolves, depictions of the feral man in cultic iconography. But I was wrong." He zoomed in on the repeated motif, the vertical bars capped by the elongated muzzle. "It is not a canine muzzle, Cross. It is a face stretched by choice. Look at the articulation of the forelimbs. It has human wrists. And the fingers, they are not claws grown from bone. They are opposable thumbs, articulated for tool use." He swallowed hard, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. These are not savages. These were soldiers, priests. They did not devolve into beasts. They ascended into something capable of planning, of ritual, of wielding power. The things that took the sensor, the things that left the print, Cross said, the words heavy and leaden, they are not just hungry. They are intelligent. He referred to the creatures as sentinels from now on. The sun climbed higher, baking the canyon, and the tension grew thicker. Harper, recovering from the previous day's grim finds, set up his tripod to reshoot some of the symbols Wright had translated. He switched on the powerful external flash. FZZT. The light struck the wall. It did not bounce back. It was swallowed. The flash unit, designed to punch through shadows, created a brief, stark outline of the wall, but the symbols existed in a dimension impervious to light. They were blacker than the shadow, only truly visible in the faint, red-tinged spill from Harper's lantern. The grinning, stretched faces on the wall drew the light into themselves, thriving only in the realm of the unseen. The heat had begun its slow, deliberate descent toward the camp when the first attack came. It was not a stealth operation. It was a charge. Cross, on watch, was looking at the ridge when the movement caught his eye. a sudden chaotic displacement of dust and rock, followed by a sound that made the hairs on his neck stand up. A guttural, wet thrash of heavy bodies moving fast. He raised his rifle, sighting. There were 3 of the sentinels. They moved with an awkward, heavy-footed gait at first, like men running in oversized boots. But then they shifted, their bodies elongating, their speed accelerating into a low, ground-eating lope, a nearly silent, impossibly fast run. And then he saw it through the scope. A figure that stood on 2 legs but was grotesquely disproportionate. Shoulders hunched, arms thick and low-swinging, covered in hard, coarse black hair. The head was lowered, but the eyes, even from 200 yards, burned with a predatory yellow light. They were smart, too smart for mere predators. Contact. 3 inbound 200 yards. Cross roared, firing 3 quick rounds. The shots echoed, a ridiculously thin sound in the vast silence of the canyon. The first round missed. The second caught the lead figure in the chest. There was a sickening thwack. The creature did not fall. It did not slow. Instead, its trajectory altered. A burst of impossible energy drove it sideways, toward the sheer canyon wall. As it ran, Cross saw something extraordinary. The wound, which should have been debilitating, began to smoke. A thin, sickly plume of gas, carrying that acrid scent of ozone, the smell of a lightning strike, mixed with a thicker, ferrous tang of fresh, hot blood. The creature was exploding internally, its own physical power too much for its body to contain. The third creature veered toward Harper, who was frozen by his camera. Cross fired again. Miss Moore, the geologist, reacted with an instinct that belied her academic nature. She grabbed the field shovel and screamed a wordless sound of defiance, not at the creatures, but at the sheer hideous illogic of their existence. She saw the creature Cross had wounded explode a second time, a brief, internal flash of light under its fur, before it finally stumbled, tearing at the earth with its terrible claws. It was not dying from the bullet. It was dying from its own uncontrolled fury. Fall back. Inside. Now, Cross yelled, shoving Harper toward the entrance to the ruins. The retreat was a scrambling, terrified mess. Wright dropped his notes, scattering months of work into the dust. Moore grabbed the small explosive charges Cross had brought along for possible excavation and followed them into the maw. Cross brought up the rear, firing a final warning shot that hit the stone near the second creature's feet. They tumbled into the familiar cold darkness of the subterranean labyrinth, the external silence giving way to the internal, low thrum of the earth. The air, reeking of old metal and now their own fear and sweat, closed around them. The sentinels did not follow immediately. They stopped at the entrance, their great muscled bodies heaving in the opening. Instead of the expected hunting cry, a sound of frustrated rage or victorious appetite, they let out a series of long, drawn-out howls. But these were not the howls of hunters denied their kill. These were the sounds of warning, of pain, of profound existential fear. The things that had chased them, the creatures of the canyon, were terrified of the dark, cold place they had just entered. They were terrified of the thing they guarded. The horrifying realization hit Cross with the force of a physical blow. The ruins were not their lair. They were the lock. And they, the interlopers, had just forced their way into the keyhole. They did not stop in the first chamber. Cross pushed them deeper, forcing their terrified descent into the core of the ancient structure. His mind, trained by years of battlefield calculus, seized upon a single cold certainty: survive the first rush, find a defensible position, establish fields of fire. His logical core, that well-oiled machine of tactics, was the only thing preventing his sanity from unraveling in the face of the yellow-eyed impossibility outside. They finally stopped in a tight 10-foot square camera off a side corridor. It smelled of concentrated mildew and the raw, unwashed fear that poured off their bodies. He set up a primary and secondary field of fire, establishing angles of cover and retreat, even though he knew the stone walls were their only true cover. He took the first watch, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. The cold was becoming unbearable, colder than the exterior air. It was an unnatural, oppressive cold, as if the air was saturated with liquid nitrogen, clinging to their clothes and sinking into their bones. The temperature, he guessed, was 40 degrees Fahrenheit now, a full 50 degrees colder than the heat they had fled. While Cross maintained his vigil, Wright, unable to sit still, ventured down the corridor they had not yet explored, the one the sentinels seemed most reluctant to approach. He was not looking for enemies. He was looking for answers. The last desperate attempt of the rational mind to find a historical context for the nightmare. He found the offerings in a series of small, shallow niches carved into the stone wall. They were not weapons or religious icons. They were scraps of human life. A tarnished, bent copper button, the kind used on a mid-19th century settler's coat. A piece of dried, brittle leather, part of a saddle or a boot. The objects were placed with fastidious neatness, carefully arranged like gifts, or more likely appeasements. They spoke not of a sudden attack, but of a prolonged ritualistic terror, a payment made to an overwhelming, indifferent power. Moore, meanwhile, was frantically adjusting her seismic instruments. She had set up a tri-axis geophone array, trying to get a lock on the rhythmic, heavy thrum that was the ruin's own pulse. "Cross, it is not seismic activity," she reported, her voice hushed with disbelief. "I register slow, regular pulses from deep below us. The intensity is low, but the frequency is steady. Once every 35 seconds exactly. It is an impulse wave. The earth moves, but too slowly for a tremor. It is a rhythmic, immense displacement." "What does that mean, Moore?" "It means a massive, undiscovered liquid reservoir moves at impossible speeds hundreds of feet down, or something unimaginably huge breathes very slowly in the planet's mantle." She shivered, pulling her thin windbreaker tighter. "It is the core. The core is alive." Harper, pale and visibly distressed, was reviewing the footage he had managed to capture of the initial attack and the interior symbols. He tried to find comfort in the ordered mechanism of his high-end digital camera, but the camera was betraying him. "I keep losing frames," he muttered, cycling through the playback. "Look." He showed Cross the camera screen. The footage of the corridor was clean, detailed, leading up to a sequence where he had filmed the symbols in the first chamber. The sequence cut off abruptly. Where the wall of the chamber should have been, there was nothing but a flash of burned-out white noise, a moment of photographic entropy. "The sensor is not lying," Harper insisted. "I did not press stop. It is gone. Wiped." The camera recorded a section of reality, and that section deleted itself. Cross felt the cold, hard lump of dread solidify in his gut. His terror was never panic. It was a cold, functional awareness that they were dealing with something that operated outside the laws of physics, thermodynamics, and now even optics. His only tools, his gun, his training, his rational mind, were becoming useless, one by one. He looked at his companions. Right, muttering to himself, trying to decipher the unholy grammar of the walls. More, her face a mask of exhaustion and denial, clinging to her instruments. Harper, staring at his screen, watching reality unspool. Their faces were drawn, their eyes glassy with shock and a fundamental, sickening disbelief. He saw his own fear reflected in them, not the quick flash fear of a grenade going off, but the slow, corrosive fear that comes when you realize the world is fundamentally hostile, and you are nothing but meat caught in the machinery. "We need a way out," Cross said, breaking the silence, his voice raw. "Or a better place to make a stand. The Sentinels are scared of this level." There is a reason. They pushed on, following the main artery of the tunnel, the air growing thinner, the temperature dropping further. The corridor was long, serpentine, and eventually ended in a sheer wall of collapsed boulders. It looked like a permanent dead end, a natural occurring stopper. Wright, however, was studying the way the rocks had fallen, the pattern of the collapse. "Look at the fracture lines," he said. "They are too clean." This was a man-made collapse, Cross, a deliberate seal. They began the arduous work of clearing the rubble. It took nearly an hour of exhausting labor, grunting and cursing in the icy air, before a passage was revealed. It was not a rough-hewn tunnel like the entrance. It was a doorway. The opening was precisely cut, an absolute arch leading down. There were no symbols here, no ancient scrawled warnings. The stone was smooth, polished, and black as obsidian, absorbing the beam of their military-grade flashlight completely. It was engineered, designed with a ruthless, terrifying precision. It was the color of a star that had been burned out for 1,000,000 years. "This is it," Moore whispered, her voice a strained breath in the immense cold. "This is where the fear comes from." Cross did not hesitate. He checked his magazine, pushed a heavy, military-grade flashlight into Moore's hand, and raised his rifle. He was a soldier, and when the front door was blocked, you went in through the basement. He stepped over the threshold, his boots scraping on the smooth black stone. The air was dead, and the silence here was absolute, a profound vacuum that promised annihilation. It was the only way to go. They were done with the daylight. They had reached the core of the wound. The smooth obsidian opening led onto a wide, spiraling staircase that plunged down into the earth. The stone was perfectly, unnervingly uniform, a piece of immaculate engineering carved into the living rock. The structure had shifted from crude, ancient ruin to something deliberate, intentional, and terrifyingly advanced. They were no longer in an archaeological site. They were inside a machine. The air grew heavier, the cold more pervasive, but it was the smell that truly marked the descent. The mineral stink of iron and copper, the faint clean sulfur of the ozone, and the rancid old grease smell had all intensified, becoming nearly unbearable. But threaded through it, Cross detected a new, almost synthetic odor. The smell of dry, caged electricity and profound, ancient decay. It was the stench of something powerful that had been rotting in the dark for 1,000 generations. The staircase eventually opened into a massive, dome-shaped hall. It was vast, its ceiling vaulting upward into a height their lights could not reach. The hall was utterly empty, its surface polished black stone, and here the silence was total. This was an active silence. When Moore spoke, a nervous inquiry about the size of the chamber, her voice, usually clear and strong, ceased to exist. It did not echo or dissipate. It was cut off, mid-vowel. Wright tested it, calling out a low hello. The sound was flat, dead, collapsing in on itself instantly. The Hall of Silence. As they moved across the floor, their electronic equipment began to scream. Moore's handheld compass spun wildly, its needle traversing the cardinal points with feverish, impossible speed, before locking onto a point somewhere in the center of the ceiling. The magnetic field here was violent. Harper, testing the audio on his handheld video recorder, pressed the headphones to his ears. He gasped, tearing them off. "The hum," he whispered, his face sheet white. "It is not just a thrum. It is a tone. A single, low-frequency, continuous pitch. It is not noise, Cross. It is a voice. The voice of this place. And it is deafening." In the exact center of the immense, silent magnetic hall, they found it. It was not a tomb or an altar. It was a monolith. A sarcophagus, rectangular, immense, and standing on its end, roughly 10 feet tall and 4 feet wide. It was carved from the same black, glass-smooth stone that lined the chamber, but it possessed an ancient, pitted patina that was not dust, but a hardened glaze, like solidified ancient time. As Wright cautiously approached it, holding his lamp high, the whole group felt the shift. It was a profound internal sense of arrival. The hall had waited. The tunnels, the symbols, the desperate sentinels above, all of it had been an elaborate geological approach. A 1,000-mile-long winding road leading only to this focus point. It was the nucleus, the beating cold heart of the structure. "It is a barrier," Moore whispered, her scientific language abandoned in favor of raw, primal fear. "Whatever this structure is, whatever this thing is, it was designed to hold something back, not to display it." The sarcophagus was not a solid piece. Its seams were visible, and the heavy black stone was held together by thick brass clasps. They were enormous, at least a foot long, and deeply set into the stone. Wright, leaning close, pointed his light at the surface of the clasps. They were covered in impossibly thin, spidery carvings, the same unnaturally elongated, snarling muzzles and vertical bars they had seen on the walls above. But here the symbols were twisted, distorted, and faced inward, as if they were designed to contain, not to ward off. Cross looked up, back the way they had come. They were hundreds of feet down, isolated from the world by 100 yards of stone and a terrified band of sentinels. The decision to come down here to seek the truth was a fatal, animalistic compulsion. He felt the cold, hard brass of a discarded rifle shell under his boot. He bent down and picked it up. The metal was dull, the casing slightly crushed. The shell casing was a pathetic piece of modern technology against the backdrop of this timeless, silent machine. "It is not a tomb, right?" Cross said, his voice a ragged whisper that barely made it across the short distance. "It is a trap. And we just walked right into the kill zone." He did not need to check his perimeter. He did not need to look for avenues of retreat. Every foot of stone above their heads, every silent inch of this vast, cold hall, was now an absolute, unyielding wall. The air tasted of ozone and dry rot, and the immense, humming silence was the sound of a closing door. The comfort of the known had completely vanished. All that was left was the core of the wound, and the terrifying, magnetic certainty that they were about to tear it open. Cross pulled the flashlight free of his pack. the light sickly and yellow against the blackness. He knew, with a certainty that reached into his marrow, they would not see the sun rise again. They had been drawn here by a faded ink cross on an old map to fulfill an ancient, catastrophic obligation. The shift from intellectual curiosity to desperate necessity was instantaneous and absolute. As the group stood before the monolithic sarcophagus, the silent tension in the hall became a physical, screaming need to know what was inside. Cross felt it too, a horrible, compelling pull to break the seal, to tear the final bandage off the oldest wound. To not know was to already be dead. "More," Cross said, his voice a harsh, dry whisper in the sound-swallowing air. "We use the crowbars. Right, stand back. Harper, get the emergency light ready." He organized a breach, a military operation on an alien tomb, acting purely to keep his mind from screaming. Action was the last, frayed thread of his sanity. As they began the preparations, the first sign of external reaction reached them. It was not sound traveling through the tunnel. It was vibration traveling through the bedrock. A low, collective howl of pure, agonizing fury began to resonate through the walls above. The sentinels, the creatures of the canyon, threw themselves against the threshold of the lower level. This was a shriek of desperate, profound warning. They were terrified of what the humans were about to unleash. Moore and Cross placed the heavy steel crowbars into the narrow seam of the lid. The bronze clasps looked impossibly thick, ancient rivets holding back a colossal pressure. "Ready?" Cross grunted, his feet braced against the black stone floor. Moore nodded, her face pale, the sweat on her brow instantly freezing into a clammy chill. They pulled. The immense stone ground against its base, and the air filled not with the sound of grinding rock, but with a sudden, sharp, metallic screech. The bronze clasps, subjected to the leverage, cracked with a noise like heavy canvas tearing. The moment the lid shifted an inch, a violent rush of air erupted from the sarcophagus. It hit them with the force of a blast wave, cold beyond reason, carrying the now familiar scent of fresh rot, old metal, and that dry electrical fire smell, the aroma of a 1,000-year-old supernova. Then the lights died, not slowly, but all at once. Every piece of battery-powered equipment, every headlamp, every flashlight, the tiny light-emitting diode on Moore's wrist altimeter went out, extinguished by a force that was not electrical but ontological. The darkness became absolute. It was so dense Cross felt he could scoop it up in his hand. Emergency lamp. Now. Cross barked into the absolute void, relying on muscle memory to keep his position. Harper, blindly fumbling, managed to switch on the small, hand-cranked generator lamp, a dim, sickly yellow light that only managed to illuminate a 5-foot radius, turning the vast chamber into a black, yawning void. In the weak, sickly glow, they saw the impossible. One of the sentinels had managed to break through the upper barrier. It burst into the silent hall, a nightmare of black fur and immense muscle. It was bellowing, its howl muffled by the sound-eating atmosphere, its yellow eyes wide and panicked. It did not look at the humans. It looked at the open sarcophagus. The beast's fury drained away, replaced by an absolute, visceral terror. It skidded to a halt, its claws scraping uselessly on the polished floor, and backed away from the black stone box with a series of low, warning growls, not directed at them, but at the contents. The creature, the predator of the canyons, was a frightened dog before a master's punishment. Cross saw his certainty solidify. The things outside were not the problem. They were the solution. He raised his rifle, aiming into the slit of the sarcophagus, bracing for a sudden lunge. Wright, eyes glued to the black gap, stammered, "It is not a crypt, Cross. It is a container. They kept it locked in." "What did they lock in?" Moore whispered, her voice cracking. As if in answer, something moved inside the box. It was not the unearthing of a corpse. It was the birth of an absolute, unforgivable thing. Cross lowered the rifle slightly, his combat instincts failing him for the first time in his life. He felt a wave of icy, existential dread wash over him, a cold that surpassed the temperature of the air, a cold that came from the center of his own being. They had not found a forgotten ruin. They had opened a door that should have remained eternally locked, and the guards, the terrible, magnificent, desperate beasts, had failed in their millennia-long watch. The horror was complete, and its name, Cross knew, was about to be spoken in the absolute silence of the subterranean hall. He felt the cold, hard weight of the rifle in his hands, utterly, ridiculously inadequate. The thing inside was not a monster he could shoot. It was a condition of the universe. The lid shuddered again, pushed by the immense contained mass. The last of the bronze clasps snapped with a terrifying finality. The sound was the breaking of a promise being universally revoked. The final bronze hinge groaned, shrieked, and then gave way. The massive lid of the sarcophagus slid a few more inches, grinding against the black stone base, and then stopped. The breach was wide enough. From the 1,000-year-old skin-like shrouds, which looked less like cloth and more like a membrane of desiccated flesh, something pressed out. It was a slow, sickening movement, like a deep-sea creature emerging from a tight fissure. It rose. The first impression was sheer, unholy scale. The thing's height was gargantuan, 10 feet tall. Its mass exceeded what its narrow confines should have allowed. Its body was disproportionate, elongated, a structure of impossible leverage and density. The skin, visible only in the weak, failing light of the emergency lantern, was the color of fresh ink, seemingly wet, but coated in dense, jagged, horn-like growths. The growths were not bone. They were chitinous protrusions that sprouted from the skull and shoulders, resembling the dead, burnt branches of black coral. The head turned slowly, a dome of ridged, light-absorbing nightmare. It had no discernible eyes in the human sense, but a configuration of black, pitted cavities that simply were the darkness. Cross decided to call the creature the Entity. Cross's mind, reeling, formed a single, cold, crystalline thought. This is not a predator. A predator hunts, it desires, it has limits. This thing was a profound, fundamental vacancy. It was a hole in the fabric of the world, and it was now filling their space. It moved. It placed an immense six-fingered hand on the edge of the box and stepped out. The movement actively canceled sound. There was no scrape of stone on stone, no impact of weight on the floor. The dust that should have puffed up from the displacement of air did not rise. It dissolved. Moore clutched her throat, gasping, her lungs suddenly starved for oxygen. The air pressure in the hall had shifted violently. It felt as if the space surrounding the entity was being violently evacuated. Then the sentinels attacked. The immense creature that had retreated to the doorway, the one Cross now thought of simply as the sentinel, let out a choked, desperate, howling cry that was instantly swallowed by the silent hall. It charged. Not with the calculated fury of a hunter, but with the abandoned, terrified purpose of a thing throwing itself at a bomb. The sentinel was joined by others, 3 more, who had managed to break through the upper passage. Their collective charge was a massive, desperate wave of muscle and black fur, not seeking to kill the humans, but to throw itself against the entity. The sentinels reached the giant. Their claws raked the air, snapping and tearing, but they failed to make contact. The sheer inertia of their attack was consumed a few inches from the entity's obsidian skin. One of the sentinels, the largest, managed to twist its massive body, attempting a desperate airborne ramming maneuver. It connected, not with a blow, but with a horrifying feather-light touch. The result was immediate and absolute. The creature did not cry out, bleed, or collapse. The point of contact on its shoulder began to turn a deep, non-reflective gray. The gray spread with terrifying speed, down the shoulder, across the back, over the skull. In less than 3 seconds, the massive, enraged, living beast shattered. It simply collapsed into a fine, swirling pile of non-organic gray dust. No moisture, no blood, no sound. It was converted instantly from complex life into inert mineral ash. The dust settled on the polished black floor, an emblem of ultimate perfect erasure. Right. Watching the demise of the sentinel finally broke. His intellectual firewall crumbled. He pointed a trembling white finger at the entity, a hoarse, soundless scream trapped in his throat. The symbols. The bars were not prisons. They were containment. The wolves were not the evil. They were the guards. They tried to keep it locked in. The giant ignored the remaining sentinels, who were now paralyzed by the horrific death of their comrade. It ignored the humans. It stepped over the pile of gray dust, its movement a slow, indifferent glide, and moved toward the center of the vast, echoing hall. Cross raised his rifle, sighting on the entity's immense chest, but his finger would not move. He knew with a certainty that reached into the cold core of his being that a bullet would be meaningless. A small, pathetic piece of lead against a creature that was merely a physical manifestation of a broken law. They were trapped. Behind them, the few remaining sentinels, their bodies still heaving with terror and defeated rage, were utterly paralyzed at the entrance. In front of them, the giant, the thing of black coral and silent consumption, was moving slowly toward the center of the hall, toward the invisible axis. The entity paused. It rotated its horrific ridged head toward the trapped humans. It was not the movement of a predator sizing up a meal. It was the movement of a force calculating the least significant point of resistance. Cross felt the absolute cold emptiness emanating from the creature, a force that did not want to kill but simply to erase. They were not a challenge. They were merely the next most available piece of matter for consumption. The core of the ancient horror was out, and their small, fragile human reality was about to be peeled back to nothing. The entity stood, immobile, its immense, horn-plated skull fixed on the small group of humans huddled in the weak light. It was an appalling sight, a sculpture of non-life, radiating a cold so deep it absorbed the light, the heat, and the very concept of vitality. Cross finally fired, not out of tactical hope, but out of a visceral animal need to break the silence, to impose some kind of Newtonian order on the impossible physics of the hall. He emptied the magazine, 3 rounds of heavy-gauge ammunition, aimed for the chest. The ammunition, fast and true, flew its intended path. It did not ricochet, pierce the skin, or slow the giant. In the final agonizing inch before it made contact, the ammunition simply stopped. It lost all its kinetic energy, its form collapsing slightly, and it dropped to the polished black floor, cooling with a faint, metallic tink, tink, tink that sounded utterly ridiculous in the monumental silence. It was now just spent lead, inert before a presence that consumed the physics of existence. Moore, the geologist, her mind already stretched past the breaking point, was staring at the floor, not at the giant. The polished black stone under her feet, the basalt density material she had sworn was ancient and stable, seemed to ripple. It was disintegrating from a lack of cohesion. She felt the ground beneath her yielding, turning from solid rock to shifting sand, as if the entity's presence was unbinding the molecular bonds of the earth itself. The foundation was gone. "There is no support," she gasped, her voice choked. "It is destroying the structure, not with force, with negation." Harper, the photographer, suddenly surged forward. His sanity had broken completely. He fumbled for his professional strobe unit, an auxiliary flash system. "I need to record it," he screamed, his voice a tight, frantic squeak that died almost instantly. "I need one picture to prove it." He aimed the powerful flash, switching it to maximum output, intending to blast the entity's form into temporary visibility. Flash. For a millisecond, the giant was illuminated in a dazzling white light. The light was hideous, showcasing the polished, wet-looking skin, the black coral ridges, and the profound vacancies that served as its eyes. Then the light snapped off. The flash unit had died instantly. The entity, which had been ignoring them, turned its immense horn-plated head toward Harper. It was not a violent turn. It was a slow, deliberate movement of classification. And then, in the absolute darkness, Cross saw a distortion, a brief ripple in the lightless void that reached out. It was a hungry hole in the air itself. Harper made no sound. He did not cry out. He did not even fall. In the sickly yellow light of the small emergency lamp, which still flickered near the wall, all that remained was his empty, high-end, metal-bodied camera. It hit the floor with a clatter. His clothes, his body, his very presence were deleted. A moment of silence, terrible and profound, descended. Then the sentinels moved. The remaining 3 beasts at the entrance, who had been frozen in terror, charged again. They knew what was at stake. This was not a hunt. It was the final, desperate resistance of an ancient, failed guard. They attacked with a suicidal, blind rage, throwing their mass at the entity, not to wound it, but to impede its movement, to stop its slow, methodical glide toward the center of the hall. Their howls, though muffled, were now a pure, untainted sound of sacrificial fury, a bestial prayer to a cruel, indifferent god. The entity paused, its attention momentarily fixed on the furious, pointless assault. It had turned its attention from the humans who were insignificant to the sentinels, who were an annoying, delaying mechanism. The giant took a slow, deliberate step toward the new threat. Wright, the anthropologist, his last vestiges of academic sobriety evaporated, collapsed to his knees, clawing at the black stone floor. He was sobbing, not with tears, but with a horrifying, dry, rattling sound. "It is not a demon," he babbled, his hands scratching at the ancient symbols carved on the sarcophagus, seeking an answer that was not there. "It is not a monster. It is proto-entropy. It is the end state of all things, the absolute zero of existence." Cross felt it too, the invisible, crushing pressure. It was not the weight of fear, but a physical certainty that his own body was about to be disassembled into its constituent parts, reduced from complexity to dust. The terror was tactile, a profound, sickening urge to simply lie down and let the inevitable unmake him. The battle was over. The giant, having eliminated one of the sentinels with another touch, slowly, with an air of immense and terrible patience, began to turn its horrific coral-plated head back toward the last two surviving humans. Cross watched the sentinel's final fight. The remaining two beasts were simply throwing their immense bodies at the giant, one after the other, attempting to shove it back toward the open sarcophagus. They had been terrified of entering this hall, but their terror of the entity was greater. Their goal was the slow, desperate, impossible recontainment of the thing they had failed to guard. Their ancient, feral rage, Cross realized, was the shield that had protected the world for centuries. He looked at Moore, the geologist, standing stunned beside him. Her face was calm now, stripped of all expression except for a terrifying cold comprehension. She moved with an unnerving, deliberate slowness. She reached down, pulling out the small Composition C4 explosive charges Cross had brought along for possible controlled rock removal. She held the small square packages in her hand, her eyes locked on the giant. "The rifle will not work," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "The physics fail, but the blast, the energy, must go somewhere." "Moore, what are you doing?" Cross snapped, his voice rough. "I choose a loud exit, Cross," she replied, a faint, terrible smile touching her lips. "It will not stop it, but it might delay the structure collapse long enough for you and Wright to get out." She was already arming the timers, setting the small cylindrical detonators into the plastic explosives. She looked at Wright, who was still on his knees, scratching nonsensically at the stone, and then at Cross. "Run," she said, her voice now firm, a final unyielding command. "It will ignore the blast, but the hall will not." Cross, a man of brutal, instant decision, grabbed the lapel of Wright's dusty field coat. He hauled the anthropologist, a man already broken into 1,000 pieces of philosophical dust, to his feet, and began dragging him toward the spiral staircase. He looked back just as Moore, standing only 15 feet from the entity, threw the charges against the two central support columns of the vast dome-shaped hall. She looked at Cross one last time, a look of profound, terrible pity, and then turned away. The explosion was muted, suppressed by the sound-eating atmosphere of the hall, sounding more like a massive wet slap than a detonation. The blast did not hurt the entity. It paused, turning its ridged head slowly, a creature feeling a strong, annoying breeze. But the energy, unable to harm the giant, poured into the supporting columns. The immense stone ceiling, the keystone of the engineered darkness, groaned. The stone did not just crack. It began to tear, the fractures running up the dome in long, deep, terrifying lines. The foundation of the chamber gave way, and the hall began to collapse inward. Cross, hauling Wright's nearly lifeless weight behind him, scrambled up the spiral staircase. The remaining sentinels, seeing the chamber roof begin to fall, seeing their prison, their centuries-old lock shatter, turned and, in an act of synchronized animalistic despair, also began to retreat, moving with impossible speed back toward the upper levels. Halfway up the stairs, Wright stumbled. Cross tightened his grip on the man's coat, but Wright did not fall. He just stopped moving, his feet planted firmly on the cold black stone. "Right. Move." Wright looked at him, his eyes wide and unblinking, filled not with panic, but with a terrible icy realization. A thin gray crust, like the dust of the disintegrated sentinel, began to spread across his cheek, starting from his temple and moving across the contours of his face. He did not bleed or scream. He was simply ceasing. The non-local, the non-Euclidean. It touches you, Cross. It does not need to kill. It just unravels. He was looking through Cross into a distance of absolute void. His eyes suddenly locked, glazed over with a deep, horrible, dead knowledge. He had not survived the contact with the illogical. The reality of the entity proved too much for the man who tried to catalog the world. He was a piece of information that had been corrupted and erased. Cross let go of the coat. Wright remained standing, a graying, inert statue on the black stairs. Cross did not look back. He ran. He burst into the upper level, the chamber with the bones, the air thick with the smell of ozone and sulfur. The rhythmic thrumming of the earth had become a violent, irregular pounding. The ceiling was groaning now, the sound loud and catastrophic. He saw the last sentinel standing at the exit, looking down into the darkness of the collapsing lower hall. The magnificent beast, its fur matted with dust and its own dried blood, stood frozen in a posture of profound sorrow. Its yellow eyes, the eyes that had hunted them hours ago, were now filled with a deep, terrifying melancholy. The sentinel turned its massive head slowly. It looked at Cross, its gaze lingering for a moment of terrible shared comprehension. It raised its snout, not to snarl, but in a gesture that was shockingly deliberate. It gave a slow, measured nod. It did not run. It did not whine or retreat. The last sentinel turned its back on the light, and with a great terrible surge of muscle, hurled itself back down the gaping hole, into the darkness and the collapsing stone, into the domain of the entity. It was the final, desperate act of a sentry sealing the breach with its own life. A sacrifice aimed at buying a few more seconds for the structure to collapse and bury the thing below. Cross stood alone, his heart pounding a terrible rhythm against his ribs, the only witness to the fall of the Earth's oldest, darkest guardians. Cross clambered out of the fractured maw of the ruins, pulling himself onto the canyon floor with a last, desperate surge of his failing physical strength. The heavy dust of Montana greeted him, now feeling alien and wrong. He fell to his hands and knees, gasping, his lungs rejecting the normal, cool, high-altitude air. It was too clean, too living, a profound betrayal after the dense mineral darkness he had just escaped. He lay there for a long moment, simply inhaling and exhaling, the air scratching at his throat. The smell that clung to him was overwhelming. The pervasive, acrid stink of ozone, the old metallic tang, and the profound, sickening aroma of dry nothingness. It was the smell of his own near erasure, a chemical marker of the void that had touched him. In his mouth, the metallic, sour taste that he had first mistaken for old rust was stronger now. It was the flavor of absolute entropy, the dry, electric taste of the entity, coated his tongue like an invisible, corrosive soot. He pushed himself up, his eyes scanning the surrounding canyon. The landscape was in agony. Around the collapsed entrance to the ruins, the earth was splitting. Deep, black, ruler-straight lines, faults that required millennia to form, radiated out from the central collapse. like the score marks left by a titanic, invisible fingernail dragged across the surface. The canyon, the mountain itself, was cracking open from the strain of containing what had been released. Survival instinct, a cold, hard wire that refused to be severed, took over. He grabbed his rifle and slung it across his back. He then searched the ground near the entrance, sifting through the dust and shale. He needed proof, something physical, something that could not be explained away as mountain madness or combat fatigue. He found it 15 feet from the entrance, a piece of the black sarcophagus, a heavy triangular shard of the polished obsidian, and still tightly attached to it, one of the massive, ruined bronze clasps. He picked it up. The brass was unbelievably cold, so frigid that it burned his hand with the temperature of the deep earth. But he held on to it tightly, the heavy piece of metal a singular, tangible point in a reality that had just dissolved. The clasp, with its terrible twisted symbol, the elongated muzzle turning inward, was his witness, his proof of the ancient, failed lock. The silence that now settled over the canyon was not the quiet of the first day. This was a filled silence. It was a pressure, a vast, low, humming drone that was not a vibration on the air, but a slow, tectonic movement. It was the sound of the earth holding its breath, waiting for the consequences of his foolishness. He looked at the collapsing canyon, the old settlers' legends, the tattered maps, the cryptic warnings. They had been terrified of the place itself. The ruins were not a forgotten city. They were a prison, a seal placed on a wound, and they had been the idiots with the crowbar. The sentinels, the creatures with the yellow eyes and the terrible claws, were gone. Humanity was exposed alone, facing something that laughed at bullets and had no name. Cross began to walk. Every step was a profound effort, not because his body was tired, but because the very concept of forward momentum felt ridiculous in a world that had just lost its foundation. He was leaving the open wound, the place where physics had ceased to function. He did not look back. He had seen the ultimate truth, and it had cost him his friends and the comfort of a sane world. His mind was not screaming. It was observing, cold and absolute, and it knew with a certainty that was worse than death that he was now carrying the shadow of that perfect, hungry silence. Cross walked for an hour before his feet decided to stop moving. The sun, climbing higher toward the zenith, should have been a source of comfort. Instead, its brilliance felt aggressive, mocking. He paused on a stretch of flat, unforgiving ground, the brass clasp burning a hole of concentrated cold in his palm. He looked down at his own body. He was not bleeding, there were no broken bones, but he felt fundamentally altered, as if his internal architecture had been delicately, catastrophically rearranged. His skin seemed too loose, his bones too brittle, a hollow cage holding a vibrating, sick heart. The pressure from the entity, the sense of his own matter being classified for consumption, had left a deep, physical imprint. He was a piece of information that had been touched by the void, and now he was broadcasting that contamination. He needed water. The high desert heat, already above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, was relentless. He found a small, meandering stream trickling down a slope not far from the canyon rim, a line of thin, bright water that promised life. He knelt, cupping his hands. The water was icy cold, shocking against his feverish skin. He brought it to his lips and drank greedily. The water had no taste. It was not muddy or chalky. It was utterly, profoundly vacant. It was a texture, wetness and coldness, but lacked any mineral signature, any flavor of the earth. He drank 3 mouthfuls, and instead of quenching his thirst, it left behind a sensation of dry, internal clenching. It was another law revoked, the simple, life-giving truth of water. He walked back to the edge of the canyon and looked down at the site of their camp. It was silent, abandoned, the tent collapsed, the sport utility vehicle standing sentinel. Going back meant stepping over the threshold of that collapsing wound again. He thought of Moore, her terrible, composed smile. He thought of Wright, frozen on the stairs, and Harper, who had been erased. He had not lost his friends in a landslide or a savage attack. They had been unmade, and the sorrow of that absolute dissolution was a weight heavier than any grief he had ever known. The air thrummed again, a low tectonic moan that made the brass clasp in his hand vibrate. He looked toward the collapsed entrance of the ruins. The cracks in the earth were not widening. Instead, they began a slow, agonizing process of closure. The heavy red dust, the shale, and the boulders shifted, millimeter by millimeter, drawn together by an unseen, immense geological will. The earth of this lonely patch of Montana was actively trying to heal itself, to suture the gash they had opened. This was not a benevolent process. It was a desperate planetary triage. He had to move. He had to get to a road, to people. He picked up his rifle, slung his pack, and began a slow, limping trudge eastward, away from the canyon. He kept the brass clasp in his hand. It was an anchor, a piece of concrete, unmelting evidence against the rising tide of his own unmaking. He knew he was carrying the dry taste and the cold knowledge of the entity within him, an infection he could never purge. His journey was no longer about escape. It was about transmission. He was the courier of the bad news. He walked past a dry, bleached juniper bush. He felt a sudden, profound nausea. He stumbled, leaning heavily on the rifle, and waited for the feeling to pass. When he looked up, the sun, which had been a clear, high yellow, acquired a sickly, faint green corona around its edges, a brief, horrible shift in color that lasted only a moment. The void he had unleashed reached. It tested the light. The only defense he had left was a stolen piece of brass and the cold, unyielding muscle memory of a soldier who refuses to die. He was merely delaying his own inevitable erasure, and the thought brought with it a profound, chilling sense of lonely terror. Cross walked all day, following the line of the distant ridge, his shadow lengthening and shrinking, lengthening again, without ever offering a moment of true shade. The sun beat down, a relentless 98 degrees Fahrenheit, baking the grit on his skin, but the heat could not penetrate the cold that had settled deep within his marrow. He drank the empty, tasteless water until his stomach ached, yet his thirst remained a constant, dry knot of despair. As the afternoon wore on, the mountain behind him, the high, anonymous peak that cradled the canyon, made its final utterance. He was a good 3 miles from the site when the sound reached him. It was a single, immense, sustained tone, a low, resonant thrum that started deep, built slowly to a terrifying crescendo, and lasted for 10 full seconds. It was an inhale, a slow, heavy, profound breath, drawn by the living planetary body of the mountain. Then the sound ceased. It did not fade or echo away. It just stopped. Absolute silence returned. Thick, packed with the cold, final certainty of a massive physical action completed. He knew what it meant. He turned his head, refusing to stop walking, and glanced back at the distant silhouette of the canyon. The deep, radiating fault lines were no longer visible. The land closed up, the red, heavy dust settling back into a smooth, unbroken surface. The mountain sealed the wound, drawing the edges of the gash together with a primordial, slow-motion violence, burying the evidence and the horror beneath tons of indifferent rock. The ruins were gone. The sarcophagus, the silent hall, the gray dust of his friends, the ultimate sacrifice of the sentinels. All of it had been swallowed, locked back into the Earth's own unconscious memory. He was alone. The knowledge he carried was now his sole companion. He was not a savior or a hero. He was a survivor, and that meant he was now the carrier of the contagion. He had witnessed the true enemy, and in the absence of the guards, he had become the warning. He stopped, finally, as the sun began its brutal, slow descent, turning the western sky into a bruised orange-red tableau. He stared at the bronze clasp in his hand. It was his proof, but it was also a curse. He would not tell the world about wolves or demons. He would tell them about the silence, the taste of dry non-existence, the cold that burns, and the way the stone melted from a lack of faith. His story would be a new myth, a terrible inheritance passed down from the beasts with the yellow eyes. He dropped the clasp. The weight of it felt wrong. It landed on the ground with a soft thud and immediately began to sink into the heavy dust, pulling itself toward the center of the earth. He did not need the physical reminder. It was etched into the graying out flesh of his memory. He realized his fear was not the fight or flight response of a soldier. It was the deep, cold knowledge that the ancient enemy did not seek to kill. It sought to unmake, to reduce complexity to zero. The sentinels had not been fighting for him. They had been fighting for the continued existence of the world. He straightened up, his back to the now smooth mountain, and began to walk again. His stride was slow but steady, devoid of panic. He knew with a certainty that was absolute that he only delayed his end. The void was not defeated. It was waiting, and now it knew his name. He did not look back. There was no need. He was no longer walking away from a place. He was walking into a world that was unaware its sentries had just fallen, and he was the one now being watched by the terrible, hungry emptiness he had helped unleash. He was merely the last man standing, carrying the shadow of the dry star into the unsuspecting, fragile light. The war had just begun, and he was the first terrified volunteer.